feeding web, issues in nutritional ecology, she laid out the environmental hazards of an increasingly globalizing food system and foretold by several decades the movement to relocalize our food supply. She'll be signing copies of her latest book, Growing Older, a chronicle of death, life, and vegetables during the break. But now please make welcome Joan Gusso.
It's already given me 2 minutes. I resent that. That's not, I don't account for those 2 minutes, right? I've never been sorrier that I don't have slides, because it's bad enough to have a 20-year-old picture of yourself up there when you're standing here. It's really rotten to have it right behind you. I'm always flattered when people recognize me from my book. When I came up with the title for my talk, Realism is No Longer an Option, I wasn't sure just what subject I was going to focus on, since there's no lack of impending catastrophes about which wise people assure us that most of our proposed solutions are unrealistic. What's realistic, we're told, is to fling ourselves onward toward what we are told is progress, hoping that new and ever more clever economic or biological fixes will make everything all right. Over and over again, official voices declaim that obtaining a carbon-free society is unrealistic, that solar and wind are boutique industries, although the Union of Concerned Scientists has stated that renewable energy could reliably produce 80% of our electricity by 2050, and I had solar panels on my roof just the day before I left. Small farmers, which didn't cost me anything, by the way. Ask me about Sungevity if you don't know about it. Small farmers are nice enough, we're told, but realistically they'll never feed their nation. So the percentage of global investment that was agriculture directed dropped from 16 to 4% between 1980 and 2010. Yet the World Bank recently reported that a 1% increase in GDP in the agriculture sector in the poor world would be twice as effective in alleviating poverty as an equivalent increase in any other sector. So before I turn to my actual subject, which is soil, and I'm happy so many people have talked about it this morning, I'm going to begin with a very brief account of how I began my own long career of unrealism 36 years ago. Years before many of you were born, in 1977 to be exact, I was asked by the environmental organization Friends of the Earth to write a sort of manifesto about food, nutrition, and agriculture as a chapter for a book to be called Progress as if Survival Mattered. The plan was to put it on the desk of every incoming legislator in the vain hope that they might think if they read something. The assigned outline in regard to each topic was, where are we now? What do we need to be? And what do we have to do to get there? They gave us a couple of months, and of course it was ridiculous, but I accepted. And after an orgy of reading and thinking, I concluded the following. Modern industrial agriculture was beginning to wreak havoc on the U.S. air, soils, and water, a fact not being widely acknowledged. Worse, the same machinery and chemical-intense, labor-saving, ecologically disastrous agricultural system was being exported around the world to where people needed not CAFOs, not job-destroying machinery and export crops, but small-scale animal raising, employment, and food crops. So I concluded that from an ecological standpoint, the present global food system was environmentally unsustainable, and that everywhere in the world humans were destroying, mostly unknowingly, the underpinnings of their own survival. As for the second question, where do we need to get to? If somebody drank from this, it's okay. I needed it. The second question, where do we need to get to? The answer seemed evident. Given the inherent properties of natural systems on which we all depended, we obviously needed to end up in a world composed of much smaller, more regionally self-sustaining and self-restraining units, each of which would recognize the ecological limits within which we all have to live. Where food was concerned, this meant we needed to invest in food production systems around the world, thank you, my own water, that were based on and respected their local environments. Or in slow money terms, we had to bring money back down to earth. Since what we called progress was carrying us inexorably toward ever larger global systems, I could not imagine how such a world would emerge peaceably, if at all. And it seemed so unlikely that even to someone, if it seemed so unlikely even to someone like myself who thought a lot about it, how could such a scenario be made credible for anybody else? Which led me into the third question, and I'm an educator, so my question is always, how do we educate people to get where we all want to get to? It seemed to me the only way we might begin to turn things around was to teach people to pay more attention to the cost, the ecological, economic, and so forth costs, the ongoing global cost of producing their food. And how could ordinary citizens be made to pay attention? I thought the only way was to get them acquainted with farmers. That is, they had to get to know a farmer close up. But how on earth could eaters do that if the only farmers left were nameless bodies growing our vegetables in giant California fields, or riding tractors across the Midwest to produce vast acres of wheat, corn, and soybeans for use for the food processors and our livestock? By the way, at the time I did this, I think that the statistic was something like 98% of our produce was grown in California. Now remember, this was so then I decided the only way we'd keep the farmers in business was if we ate what they grew, and that meant we had to eat more locally. So in completely theoretical analysis, I came to the point of saying we had to eat more locally in order that we could save world agriculture. Now remember, this was 1977, and right after I said something about eating locally in a public setting, I learned what unrealistic meant. It meant, nobody will do that. You're crazy. This is stupid. Progress means eating whatever you want at whatever time of year, wherever it comes from. Why on earth would Americans give that up? Even more challenging, however, was the next statement, which was, question actually, I lived in the Northeast, so what would you eat in winter? Well, I have to tell you, it sounds easy, but in 1977, I grew up in California. I didn't learn it as a child. And by 1977, there were no farmers markets. There was no indication in the supermarket of where food came from. I didn't even know what was in season any time. So I decided the only way I could do what I was talking about was to grow my own. And that set me off on a lifetime enterprise, really. I had to grow my own in order to see what was possible, which is the beginning of my growing my own. And the rest is history. I'm still alive, despite the Hudson River's effort to destroy my garden almost every year now, with the rising of the tides, and making my way into old age, I haven't brought a vegetable in 15 years. And if I wanted to, I could actually buy local now, since local food is much more available, almost a fad, alas. And farmers markets are burgeoning. And young people are graduating from Yale are saying to their indebted parents at graduation, I might want to be a farmer. Which brings me quite naturally to soil, the topic of my remaining 7 and 32 minutes. I can't do it in that. Although I've been seriously food gardening for over 50 years and thought I was a knowledgeable friend of the soil, I was until recently stunningly naive about the lives being lived under my feet. Then I received an amazing book by Cornell professor David Wolf called Tales from the Underground. It turned out to be one of those rare volumes that changed your whole view of the world. Of course I know, as many people know, that there are millions of organisms down there, most of them too small to be noticed. But Wolf takes it further. Push your thumb and index finger into the root zone of a patch of grass and bring up a pinch of earth. You will likely be holding close to 1 billion individual living organisms. Perhaps 10,000, let me do this. Perhaps 10,000 distinct species of microbes, most of them not yet named, cataloged, or understood. Interwoven with the thousands of wispy root hairs of the grass would be coils of microscopic gossamer-like threads of fungal hyphae, the total length of which would be measured in miles, not inches. That's 1 billion living organisms, 10,000 species of microbes, and miles of fungal threads, most of them not yet named, cataloged, or understood, and just a pinch of earth. Wolf goes on to say that we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than we do about the soil because it's nearly impossible to study these organisms in the laboratory. Scientists are lucky, he says, if they can come up with the right nutrient mix to culture and study 1% of the microbes found in a typical soil sample. This poor success rate is due in part to the complex interdependence between subterranean organisms. They can't survive when isolated from their neighbors, just like we can't. We haven't learned that yet. So that's what's in our dirt, billions of interdependent organisms about which we still know more than a decade into the 21st century, very little. Now, less than 20 years ago, we introduced into this vast sea of ignorance a new technology called genetic engineering that was rapidly adopted in the US for use on major commodity crops. Genetically engineered plants, most of them designed to be invulnerable to glyphosate-based herbicide Roundup, now occupy 93% of US soybean acreage and 73% of US corn acreage. I think the corn is actually higher. I think my figure's old. So a hell of a lot of topsoil is getting sprayed every year with Roundup. It is widely known among agriculturists that glyphosate binds soil minerals, making them less available to plants. But little attention has been paid to this beyond recommending that farmers increase the manganese in their fertilizer applications to compensate for the glyphosate-induced unavailability of manganese. Then 2 years ago, the USDA was asked to approve for planting a Roundup-ready version of alfalfa, our major annual crop. Animal feed crop. In January of 2011, before the decision was made, a noted crop scientist, Emeritus Professor Don Huber of Purdue University, wrote to USDA Secretary Vilsack describing a series of disturbing agricultural problems apparently related to glyphosate, and urging the alfalfa release be postponed to allow for more research. The identified problems included infertility and early-term abortions in cattle and hogs fed GMO corn and soy, a loss of the next generation of animals that was putting some dairy farmers out of business. Researchers in the field were also noticing a rise in harmful fungi and parasites, while beneficial fungi, like some of those millions I mentioned earlier, and other organisms that help plants utilize minerals were declining. Professor Huber warned that there seemed to be a new pathogen, apparently related to the use of glyphosate, that was affecting the health of plants in the field and animals fed those plants. He asked the Secretary to slow down the approval of Roundup-ready alfalfa to allow time for careful studies of the pathogen and its effects. The letter sent confidentially to Secretary Vilsack was leaked, apparently by the Secretary's office, and within a month, Vilsack approved the unrestricted planting of alfalfa. Once Professor Huber's observations were circulated in the blogosphere, there was major pushback. There were denials, criticisms from scientists about Huber's claimed failure to provide detailed studies, and so on, although a few other scientists, mostly those close to retirement, defied a flood of hostile attacks and were reporting problems with crops and animals exposed to Roundup. At this point, the din of denial is so noisy that it's impossible to sort out how much of what Huber reported is exactly accurate. Though what is beyond dispute is that any researcher who comes up with a negative finding about a genetically engineered crop will be viciously attacked. What's undeniable is that the USDA has decided to allow a glyphosate-resistant form of the nation's most important forage crop to be planted on millions of acres, thus exposing even more soil organisms to the widely used glyphosate. And although we know very little about the organisms down there getting hit, what's certain, as Professor Huber pointed out, is that when you change one thing, everything else in the web of life changes in relationship. Now let me move on to a personal story about my beloved food-producing garden on the west bank of the Hudson River that was utterly destroyed by that river in 2010. Rebuilt to be 2 feet higher so the land would at least drain, most of the garden ended up with some topsoil, except for 4 beds filled to the top with subsoil, so rock hard that when a friend came by with a pickaxe to break up one bed, we tossed the lumps into the river because they were too unyielding to smash. I knew how to turn this stuff into fertile soil over time, but I wanted to use the bed immediately and struggled to imagine what might agree to grow there. Ultimately, I decided to plant sweet potatoes in one bed, my experience being that sweet potatoes would grow anywhere and at least cover the bed with pretty foliage. Mid-June, I went out and planted 12 sweet potato slips that I'd sprouted from one of last year's crop. As expected, the bed produced mountains of beautiful foliage, which at least made it look nice. and in October, a friend and I dug in to see what had developed underground. Considering the situation, I had a remarkably good crop, 23 pounds of sweet potatoes from a 3 by 12-foot space. But more remarkable was what the roots had done to the soil. In one growing season, the sweet potatoes had converted a bed of silt that hardened into rock when you looked at it, into a crumbly soil you could plunge your hand into. Concluding after a web search that this beneficial sweet potato effect was not common knowledge, I asked around and finally reached a farmer who was also a microbiologist, the first person I talked to who was not surprised. He told me that certain soil organisms collect sugar off the root hairs of these big-rooted crops and excrete a compound called glomalin that glues together the soil particles, preventing them from packing into a rock-like mass. Here's part of the text of a pamphlet he sent me called, "What is Glomalin?" I have 7 seconds, and I'm not going to finish, so give me another minute. Glomalin was identified at the USDA in the early 1990s on hair-like projections of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, those ones I was talking about. These fungi are ancient microorganisms that evolved with plants to aid in acquiring nutrients, especially immobile nutrients like phosphorus. So now we know. Here's an ancient vital organism, absolutely critical to the texture, the phosphorus availability, and therefore the production capacity of our soils. As the pamphlet on glomalin says, it's literally holding our farms together. And yet, as another of my soil books reports, glomalin was considered an unidentified contaminant of humus until 1996. So until 17 years ago, we farmed in total ignorance of these essential organisms. Obviously, we've been growing our food cluelessly, as if nature were an enemy with whom we are at war, drenching our soils with chemical novelties to kill organisms we deemed our foes, unconcerned about the fate of our unknown friends. Year after year, we've dumped a single chemical, glyphosate, on literally millions of acres, assuming that it would do only what we intended, kill weeds. We don't need Professor Huber's assertions to know that glyphosate is changing the invisible lives of the soil, and that those underground organisms, most of us are hardly aware of, are probably more vital to our long-term survival as a species than any of the larger living things we encounter every day. And so it's evident that where soil is concerned, realism is no longer an option. We cannot go on treating soil like dirt and expect to survive. Unrealistic as it is to imagine 7 billion people taking a stand on behalf of the organisms under their feet, it seems much more likely than just going on as we are. Thank you.